I've been talking a lot lately about hard to read books. I did a video about why you should read them, a video about how to read them, and now, as promised, here is a video about some of the more challenging books that I've personally read. Now, let me preface this by saying I'm not claiming that these are the most challenging books in the world to read, and I also tried to give a broad selection of books that are difficult for different reasons, because I think there's a lot of things that can make a book daunting or challenging to get through. There are also a lot of books out there that I know are extremely difficult that I either am just not interested in or haven't gotten to yet. So if your favorite hard to read book is not on this list, that's probably why. And before we get started, I do want to tell everyone that our book of the month for our book club in February is The Sellout by Paul Beatty. If you're interested in joining a fantastic community of other readers to read this book along with us and a bunch of other books, the link is down below. Okay, so the first book that I want to talk about is one that you pretty much never see on these types of lists, and not because it's not challenging to read, but it's just not that popular of a book. For whatever reason, it's kind of slipped through the cracks. A lot of people aren't reading it today and talking about it on social media, despite the fact that the author is a Nobel Prize winner for literature, and that is The Flanders Road by Claude Simon. So what makes this book challenging? Well, he was part of a writing movement where their whole kind of approach was to write each book in its own individual style. So a lot of writers, of course, you read one of their books and then another, and you can see the similarities in the writing style. That apparently was not the approach for writers like Claude Simon. Now, I haven't read anything else from him, so I can't confirm that, but that is part of the club he was in. So this book is very experimental, and it's effectively about his experience in World War II. Even though it is a fiction, it is based on real-life experience. He was part of a horse-mounted cavalcade for the French, and they pretty much got obliterated by a German Panzer tank division almost immediately. And one of the first things he kind of experienced as a soldier was seeing his captain or whoever was leading his platoon shot off of his horse and killed, like in the first 5 minutes of battle. So what makes this challenging is it's kind of written like if somebody wrote a book purely fueled by PTSD. It has a lot of fractured imagery. It repeats a lot of the same vignettes or scenes over and over and over again with only slightly different variations from time to time, but they're scattered about, so you never really know exactly when he's going to recount a specific moment, because there's a lot of memories from personal life and his personal relationships blended in here. The sentences are extremely long. In fact, there's maybe only a dozen or 24 periods in this whole book. There are very few paragraph breaks. There's minimal punctuation as far as the quotation marks and other things to indicate dialogue. And almost nothing is explicitly stated to you. So everything is kind of implied. You're left to infer. You have to piece together what this imagery is trying to tell you, and it's very tangential. So it'll start kind of depicting a scene, and then it'll veer off to something else, and then a page and a half later return back to that original scene that it was describing, and you really have to pay attention while you're reading it. Fortunately, it is short, but even with that said, it still took me about a month to complete, and I obviously didn't get everything out of it. I probably should reread it at some point, but it was a very challenging work, but enjoyable nonetheless. I think some of the writing was very beautiful. There were a few scenes that really stood out to me. One was a very lengthy description of a droplet of water falling off of like a wooden beam, and then another was the shadow that a horse was casting as it galloped in the sunlight. And both of them were just extremely beautiful, but you really had to pay attention to kind of figure out where they fit in the greater context. If you want an example of the language in this book and how tricky it can be, our pretty recent podcast episode about some of our favorite works in translation, I read an excerpt from this book on that episode, so might be worth checking out. The next book on this list is the only nonfiction on the list, and I wanted to include it not because it's got super challenging language, although there is a little bit of that in there, but nothing compared to some of these other books. But philosophically, it's very dark, depressing, nihilistic, and the author also references a lot of other philosophers or schools of thought. And if you're not familiar with these people or these ideas, it can be a slog to not only just look these people up, but get at least a basic understanding of what they believed and how his arguments kind of interact with them. So that's what made it tough. I read this years ago. I really need to reread it, and I don't even remember how I came across this book. I think somebody referenced it in a YouTube video one time, and I bought it blind. This is The Conspiracy Against the Human Race by Thomas Ligotti, who's actually predominantly known as a short story horror writer. And this book also kind of famously was, I guess you could say, plagiarized by True Detective Season 1, which in my opinion is one of the best seasons of television of all time. But Rust's character, played by Matthew McConaughey, has a few lines in that show that are pretty close to things directly from this book. So there's a little bit of controversy about that. But basically, this is just about how life is kind of meaningless and life is grotesque, and it's just a deeply disturbing, bleak book, which, aside from the research you have to do, makes it a challenge to get through because it's just so depressing to read. But with that said, I do think if you're interested in philosophy at all, it is at least worth taking a look at, because there are some unique ideas in here, even though you might not come to all the same conclusions that Ligotti does. And I'm probably due for a reread on this, because I think at the time I just was not as mature of a reader or a person. I probably read this at this point maybe 15 or 16 years ago. To kind of put in perspective how bleak this book is, it's blurbed by David Benatar, who's a pretty well-known antinatalist philosopher from South Africa. It's also worth noting that Ligotti lives in Florida, which is maybe why he's so pessimistic. I can already hear the comments on this one. That book's not hard to read. And if that's you, good for you, bro. We're all very proud of you. But most people are going to find this book to be challenging, and for a lot of reasons, but also because it's just a freaking long book. It's 1,200 pages long. And of course, it's Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. So, aside from its length, what makes it challenging? Well, like a lot of postmodern or post-postmodern writers, Wallace forgoes a lot of punctuation that would indicate dialogue, so you really do have to be paying attention to who's talking and when and how. There's also a gigantic cast of characters, and so they can be a little bit tricky to stay on top of. There's a lot packed in here about politics, philosophy, geopolitics, the human condition. There's a lot of characters that you get introduced to and never see again. There's characters that you get introduced to and they don't come back around for hundreds of pages, and by the time you get back to them, you might have forgotten about them. This book famously has extensive endnotes, so people often recommend that you read this with 2 bookmarks, one so you can mark where the endnotes you're reading are, and then of course wherever you're stopped in the regular book. And some of the endnotes, I mean, you have to read all of them. They are part of the story. Some of them are ridiculously long. For example, there's a character in this book that is a filmmaker, and the endnotes are an entire catalog of every film they've ever made. And it seems almost endless, but you feel like you have to read them, because what if there is one little kernel of information in there that you need to unlock some other part of the book, which is actually kind of how it goes. The book is also over 500,000 words, and the page, I mean, this is a very physically tall book, and it's just walls of text. So that can make it quite daunting. And the language itself is, for the most part, I would say medium difficulty, but there are moments where Wallace kind of flexes his linguistic prowess a little bit, so that's challenging as well. Yeah, and it's just a book that requires a lot of patience and getting through it. I think even if you're enjoying what you're reading, if you're reading a book and you feel like you're not really making any headway, that can be very demotivating. And that is something that can happen with this book, because you will just read page after page after page after page and just feel like you haven't made a dent in your progress, because it's just so freaking long. This next one is one of my favorite books by one of my favorite authors, and this is The Tunnel by William H. Gass. This came out in 1995, the year before Infinite Jest, and this is also quite a long book, but what really makes this challenging is 3 primary things. Number 1, Gass was a master of language, and he plays with language so much that sometimes it can be difficult to unlock what he's really trying to tell you as a reader, because his set of linguistic skills are just very far beyond mine, at least, and I think probably most other average readers. The themes in this book are also very dark and brooding and depressing, much like The Conspiracy Against the Human Race. But then this book also is what I would call ergodic literature, where it really plays with the formatting of the book. So not only is there a lot of different typesettings and typefaces that are played with here, but there's also drawings and imagery and text arranged in very strange ways. So when you combine those three things together, the advanced language, the strange formatting, and the dark subject matter, and then you layer on top of it like a lot of references to poets and writers and philosophers, it's just a challenging read. Now, with that said, this does appear on a lot of people's lists of most challenging books that they've read, but I don't think it's quite as hard as a lot of other books that usually make those lists. So, for example, I don't think it's as hard as something like Ulysses. I don't think it's as hard as probably some William Faulkner. I had read some other William Gass previously, namely Omen Setter's Luck, which in its own right is quite a difficult book. So I think having done that, it made Approaching the Tunnel just more manageable for me. And the last book on this list, most of you could probably guess what it is or what it's going to be. It's so difficult, in fact, I've yet to finish it. I've only read half of it, and that is Gravity's Rainbow by Thomas Pynchon. Now, I've read a couple of Pynchon's books at this point, and what you will find with them is when you hear about a Pynchon book, you often hear how challenging it is and how he's such a quirky, out there writer. And you start his books and you think, this isn't too bad. But a lot of books where they start kind of scattered and like tie things up as you go through the text, Pynchon's books work in the opposite way. So his books almost start like a tight spiral, and then that spiral starts to unravel as you get further through the book. And I found Gravity's Rainbow to be no exception to that. The first probably 20, 30, 40, 50 pages even, I thought, I got this. I know what's going on. This isn't as hard as everybody claims that it is. And then around the 275, 300 page mark, I was like, I have absolutely no freaking clue what the hell's going on. And a lot of people say that the latter half of the book is the most challenging part. So why haven't I finished this? Well, it wasn't like a true DNF. It wasn't like I consciously said, I give up, I'm not picking this book back up. But what did happen was, as I was reading it, I got sidetracked with some other things in life, and I just didn't have the time to keep reading this daily. And I think I went about 2 or maybe 3 weeks in between picking it up. And when I picked it back up, I just felt so much more lost. I said, okay, I have to stop and go back to the very beginning and start again. And I just haven't had the time to do that yet. But I promise you that this is definitely deserving of being on lists of most challenging books. And people who tell you otherwise either are just fronting and they read it and had no idea what happened, or they're just trying to brag, because I don't know anyone who's genuinely read this and thought, yeah, I totally get it. So if you're not familiar with Gravity's Rainbow, it's effectively about World War II, although it's more in the background than anything else. And it follows the story of some people who are fighting in World War II, and one of them is kind of being experimented on in some Pavlovian type of way to trigger an erection every time he hears a V-2 rocket being launched. So as you can probably guess, despite it being considered a great piece of American literature, it is quite satirical and I would say highbrow concepts disguised with lowbrow writing. So if you've read any of these, I would love to know what you think of them, and which books would you have put on your list as the hardest you've ever read. Also, if you're not a reader yet, but you want to be, I probably would not start with one of these. I would maybe check out some of these instead.